For your discussion this week, I have you guys looking at sort of a more recent system level collaborative called the South Atlantic Salt Marsh Initiative, or SASME. This is more of an ecosystem-based but region-wide initiative focused in on salt marsh. What's interesting about this initiative is I would say that it is landscape and scale, because a lot of thought goes into how the adjacent terrestrial environment affects the salt marsh, and even the future of the marsh and where we might see marsh migration with rising sea level in the future. But my role with this group was to work with another co-lead, Queen Quit, who's the chiefess of the Gullah Geechee Nation in the South Atlantic region, and to think about some of these cultural values that relate to the salt marsh. So I have included for your reading this week our topic team paper that focuses in on cultural values, and also just another little clip about this initiative. But I wanted to go a little deeper. This is a presentation that was presented to the steering committee of the South Atlantic Salt Marsh Initiative, and it's a way to think about how cultural values can fit into the planning and the thinking for this particular initiative. So you guys are already familiar with the open standards for conservation planning, so I'm not going to go into this again, but as you will recall, it's an adaptive wheel that includes planning and implementation, analysis, and then sharing that information out, reassessing, and revising. And you have seen this graph as well, that flow from conservation targets to ecosystem services to human well-being values. And so there's an obvious and inherent link in this flow to understand that some of those cultural values are housed in the ecosystem services that are provided, and then also in the human well-being scope of a project. And this is a slide that you saw in your last slide too, but I wanted to note that these somewhat intangible targets of spiritual health and cultural identity are human well-being targets that we can identify, but there's obviously a challenge in being able to measure these sorts of values. So I wanted to share this. This is one way we can think about how the importance of cultural identity is by actually looking at the loss of cultural identity as a threat in a results chain as we think about how to create strategies for our conservation targets. So in this case, you could probably replace that general conservation target in green with restored healthy salt marsh. And we look at this interplay between how loss of cultural identity, loss of traditional ecological knowledge being passed on to younger generations can in itself be a direct threat to that system, and that's a feedback loop that once we have a degraded system, then we have further loss of the cultural identity to that system and aren't able to sustain that as a target. This is a flowchart that it helps to spend a couple of minutes with this result chain. In this case, this is looking at a forest system as the target in green there, but it's a socially beneficial result that that they're targeting here. So in this case, they are looking at a strategy that is a eco-certification proposal for timber harvest. In this case, the strategy would lead to loggers that implement the certification practices and loggers getting more money from certified products. So an incentive to actually practice sustainable forestry methods. That leads to a benefit for forestry livelihoods. But then you can follow that chain through and see that that should also lead to a reduction in threat of unsustainable logging should decline. And then you can see the other ecosystem services that might stem out of a more sustainable logging program. So this is just a little bit of thought that you'll see mirrored in the cultural values paper. There's some obvious tangible potential targets that we might see, such as sacred burial sites or shell middens that are important to Native American tribes that use this marsh landscape over time. There are some obvious ecosystem services for human communities that are provided by the salt marsh, from storm surge protection and flood mitigation to water quality benefits. And also, of course, the provisioning services of livelihood and subsistence, people that rely upon the salt marsh as nursery grounds for the fisheries, for oystering, for shrimp, and for their livelihoods. And then we have other well-being targets, including spiritual connection to place, view sheds provided, and recreation and access. So this is when we think about including cultural targets within the scope of a project. So we know the overriding scope for this salt marsh project is to protect, restore healthy, intact marshes in the southeastern United States. But because there is spatial data available, we may also want to include certain sites, tangible cultural targets in our conservation scope. So this particular graph looks at historic temples, but that could easily be sacred burial grounds or shell middens that we map and understand spatially where they exist. And then we can think about the importance of those for, in this case, they talk about the possibility of a cultural learning experiences, opportunities for aesthetic, spiritual enjoyment, and how that can benefit both spiritual health for human well-being as well as tourism livelihoods. So all to say that in this particular initiative, we are looking at cultural and societal considerations as a lens that could be embedded into the final plans. They could be embedded as tangible targets that can be mapped and understood, but they can also be embedded as some of these intangible targets that we understand the relationship between the marsh and folks' cultural identity and spiritual well-being. They might also be socially oriented strategies that we look at that we know have a benefit to communities that depend upon the marsh. And again, they can even be a threat to the marsh when we recognize loss of cultural identity and a stewardship ethic will eventually contribute to degradation of the marsh.